I think it absolutely needed Avery and Woodruff. Avery was a golden-tongued orator. I mean, this was a serious road promoter.
Susan Croce Kelly, thank you for joining me today on The Place for History. We're going to talk about Cyrus Avery today, considered the father of Route 66. And Susan, I thought we'd start with his early life because that informs what we see him develop later in life. So what can you tell me about his early years?
I agree with you. I think in a way he was a model for the whole culture that the country ended up with. He was born in Pennsylvania, and in the 1870s there was a big business disruption, and his father, I don't know if he lost all his business, but his father came west to see if they could find a better life,
Hmm.
and came home, and Cy and his father took a covered wagon, from what the family told me, and came west to Indian Territory,
Wow.
which was seen as a place for a big opportunity. And they must have come to St. Louis and crossed the Mississippi there, and then come down through Missouri along what became Route 66 on south of Joplin to the very corner of the state, and then went into just that corner of Oklahoma over there. And his father raised horses and other livestock. And he grew up going once a month back to Missouri, 30 miles away, to get the mail. So, in the course of the covered wagon in those early years, he had to deal with terrible roads, other other vehicles that didn't work very well. I'm sure on the trip west, he had to help pull other, he was a teenager. So if a wagon got stuck, I'm sure he was called to help and get it out of the mud or the side off the side of the road.
Right.
And early on, he became a big promoter for automobiles, for automobiles and better roads because of that. And this
So,
was a movement that started in the 1880s, actually, with bicycles. On the East Coast, I guess the elite East Coast people were the one who rode bicycles, and they started they started demanding better roads, and that spread as cars became, if not prevalent, at least obvious that there were going to be everybody was going to have a car before this was over. And at the 1893 World's Fair, there was a big good roads convention that said we've got to have better roads. And they kind of organized. There was a newspaper that soon had 1 million subscribers. I mean, just like that, to call for better roads. And Congress had the idea in the beginning that it was the state's business to pave the roads, and
oh, the United States government said we're not
not
getting
us.
involved
Not us.
in
There
roads.
had Thomas Jefferson had pushed for a national road in 1803, and they started to build it, and it got as far as Vandalia, Illinois. Now remember, building it meant grading it. There was no pavement anywhere, but they
Yeah.
got as far as Vandalia, and it was time to refinance. And they looked around and said, "Oh, well, railroads are going to take care of that. We're not going to finance the road anymore." So
Mhm.
Congress said, "Not our problem." And the people began electing good roadmen to Congress. And they began having, I guess, conventions just to get together and raise hell about getting better roads. And Avery was never elected to Congress, but he became the first, or he became the uh, chief of the administrator of the county in Tulsa for in 1815 and 16. And that's when he started actually building roads, besides just, having picnics and making speeches and doing everything he could to call for better roads.
So
And
if we
from
go back to this time, people have to remember again that the roads might be rutted, muddy, if you had a road at all, no pavement, and maybe no signs either. No signs saying which way you had to kind of know that this farmhouse is where you turn left. It would be
ex
easy to get lost, right?
exactly. And if you remember the old auto trail road, well, wait, let me back up again. Uh, in 1808, Henry Ford introduced the Model T. That meant everybody could have a car.
1908?
1908, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
And in 1909, up in Wayne County, Michigan, up by Detroit, the highway engineers laid the first mile of concrete pavement.
Mm.
So right there, you know that there was a lot of catching up that was going to have to be done. And then road paving, like I said before, was too expensive for the states to handle by themselves. But the fellow that started the Indianapolis Speedway was a very wealthy man, and he and his friends decided that they would have the first national highway across the country that was paved, and that was the Lincoln Highway, and they couldn't afford to pave it.
Mm.
So, the build up for good roadsmen and federal money came along, and finally the courts decided it was okay. And in the meantime, like I said, Avery was paving roads in Tulsa, and he became president of a couple of these kind of, I called them do-it-yourself highways, like the Lincoln Highway, where people would get together and say, okay, we're going to have a road from Springfield to Branson. And in fact, there was one. And all the towns along the way are going to help pay for it. And there was never enough money, and they're going to keep it up. Well, there was never enough money or enough interest to keep the roads in what was then top condition. So people got stuck in the mud in the spring and the fall. In the summer, when the roads were dry, they were dusty or rutted. In the winter, it was just a mess. And there was this great groundswell and push. And Avery, let's see, the feds finally started giving money, matching funds to the states
Yeah.
in 1916, and then again in 1921 after World War I. There was another big push. And in Missouri, they passed what was called the Centennial Road Law and put aside $60 million to build Missouri roads in 1921. Excuse me. But so the states began to have money, and they began paving their roads, the main roads. That's where the money was to go. But they didn't necessarily talk to each other because they were so busy. And these guys who were the new highway engineers and head of the highway departments all knew each other because they'd all been involved in trying to get better roads for a long time. And back in 1914, they'd formed a national organization. Okay, now back to Cy. He stayed involved with roads, and in 1924, he was appointed the state highway commissioner for Oklahoma, which made him a member of this national highway group of state highway officials. They got together and said, we've got to have some kind of a coordinated effort, because the old auto trails like the Lincoln Highway or the Ozark Trails or the Midland Highway or the Bankhead Highway had great advertising. Come this way, drive this way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the roads were terrible, and most of the signage would be a square patch of paint with a couple of different patches of letters on the side of it, and they were on telephone poles and fence posts. So like the Lincoln Highway was a green L on a white background. Well, if it rained and the fence post faded, or if the fence fell down, you didn't know where you were. So these highway officials said, we not only need to pave the roads, we've got to figure out a national way to identify them. So if you get on a road in Arkansas and you want to go to Minneapolis, you can find your way up there. And Avery was appointed one of 24 of the highway officials to talk to their colleagues and take the maps of roads that existed and put them together into a national highway system. And so that people could drive from Arkansas to Minneapolis with
Yeah.
no
And
wait.
there was some competition at this point on getting the numbering system laid out. Some people wanted
Up,
certain numbers.
up to a point. Wisconsin had started numbering highways in, I think, 1919, but I'm not sure the date. And the highway officials decided that was a good thing. That was easier to understand and made better signs than Lincoln Highway or, excuse me, or Washington Highway or any of those names, which upset a lot of people because they said it just wasn't as romantic to have a number.
Ah,
And so they decided they would do numbers, and then they decided that the main highways would be easily identifiable, and the east-west highways from the Pacific to the Atlantic would be two-digit numbers ending in 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so forth. And going north and south, because it was a longer distance, they would be two-digit numbers ending in either 1 or 5. You have Highway 1 on the East Coast still today, I think, and 101 on the West Coast up the sides of the country. Well, those were the north-south roads from the 1926 highway system. Well, they got the roads laid out, and Avery was not only on the committee, but so was a man named Pipemeyer from Missouri, who was our state highway engineer. and a man named Frank Sheets, who was head of the Highway Commission in Illinois. So Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma. Funniest thing, they made one of the main roads go from Chicago southwest to Los Angeles through the big cities where they were all from. And map got approval. And then when the numbering system was done, they had said, well, this is an important map. This is the way people travel and do business, is not from Chicago to New York, but from the west to Chicago. And they numbered their highway number 60. The group of federal highway commissioners approved the map. And then the Secretary of Agriculture looked it over and he forwarded it to the states for final approval. And when the governor of Kentucky saw the map, he raised hell because he said, no, wait, this road that's numbered 60 goes, from the West Coast to Springfield, Missouri, and it should go through Kentucky and go to the East Coast. But it doesn't. It goes to Chicago. And he said that Kentucky, what did he say? Kentucky has been besmirched. And he started to complain, and there were other complaints about the map, quibbles, about 100 of them, I think. Kansas got upset because of the different roads that they'd had, the old Santa Fe Trail and the new Santa Fe Trail, and they thought that those, whichever one wasn't included as the national highway, they thought it should have been the other way around. And in Oklahoma, there was one of the numbered highways went behind a little university in a little town, instead of having the number on the road that went in front of the university. So there were lots of quibbles, but they got solved. This thing with Highway 60 and the governor of Kentucky and Cy Avery went on and on and on for about 4 or 5 months. And, other organizations in other states began to take sides. They said, well, Avery's right. That's the road of business. And then other people said, wait a minute, the governor of Kentucky's right because the road number 60 should go all the way across the country. And it went on. And finally, one of the people from the Bureau of Public Roads in Washington wrote a letter to Avery. And he said, basically, you've got to do something or we're not going to have a national highway system. And I think that speaks to what happens when Congress has something that's not very important to get all riled up over.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just getting out of hand. And what they really needed was better roads. They didn't need a fight over a road number. And Avery came to Springfield, and he was coming to Springfield to a Rotary convention. And Pipemeyer, the man from Missouri, was at the time going around the state doing his job, talking to county commissioners and watching road building and so forth. And they met in Springfield, as you know, on April 30th, 1926. And basically they said, well, the governor of Kentucky's probably got more clout than we do. What other number is available? And after the map that the federal people had put together was for the main highways and the secondary highways. And they all were numbered accordingly, but there were numbers left over after they were finished with that. And the highway engineer from Oklahoma had come with Avery, and he turned around to the highway engineer and said, well, what numbers are left over? And the guy said, well, 66 is left over. Would that do? So there you have it.
And they decided that had a ring to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I understand 62 was also left over.
Right. The powers that be suggested that Avery could have the road north from Springfield, Missouri to Chicago as either 62 or 60 north. He didn't like either one of those choices. And the governor in Kentucky said 62 won't do anything for us. So it got very emotional and very heated and very complicated. And then they settled on 66. And whammo, that was on April 30th. In July, Avery was back here to see a friend, John Woodruff, who was opening the Kentwood Arms Hotel. And he had a big celebration, and he invited Avery to come to the celebration. And of course, paving was going on in Missouri. They'd passed this big Highway Paving Act, and Avery and Woodruff went out to look at the paving of what would be Route 66. And at the time, Woodruff turned around to Avery and said, we ought to have a booster association for this highway. And the two men agreed. And they got a small group together and kind of put together the bones of the organization in the following February, you know, 6 months later, and only 4 months after official approval by the federal government for the highway system, more than 100 people came to Tulsa for the first official meeting of the Route 66 Association. And that already speaks to the need that the people saw, because these people were from all over the country or all over Route 66 country. And they had to get to Tulsa on the muddy roads and the bad roads. And it was February, and they
Mm.
all showed up and they organized, they elected John Woodruff as the first president of the Route 66 Association. And Avery waved a $5 bill and said, "I want to be the first member." And so he stole the show and was the first member of the association. Um, and they had several goals at that meeting. One, of course, was to get the roads paved. And the 66 Association promised that, and they did. They worked behind the scenes with counties and states to get road bonds paved so they would have the matching funds for the highways. And secondly, they were going to promote the highway to the towns along the road to get them all revved up about Route 66, which I thought
Yeah.
was really novel. I never thought about that. But you got to get the towns excited if you're going to make this road famous. So that was their next thing that they did. And then they encouraged the towns not to just talk about the road, but to talk about the other things that were going on. Like Springfield would talk about the wonders of the Ozarks, to get people there, to get people to drive the road, because that was the other driving force for these highways. People wanted better roads, but in the remote areas, like from St. Louis west, there was nothing going on, and there weren't very many people.
Mm.
And money was really important. And if cars came down that highway, they would buy food, they would buy gas, they might stay all night, who knows what else. So it was really a push to bring money in. It's always about money, you know that. But
Yeah.
it was a push to bring money into all those little towns. And
So this may have started with travel and the need to get back and forth for business purposes. Avery was involved in oil, so he probably had oil trucks needing to have decent roads. But it became about tourism. Is that correct?
it
In a way.
did.
Yeah.
Well, eventually it did. I mean, right now, Route 66 isn't even a road, but it's an international tourist destination.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, um, but they sold the idea of Route 66. So time passed, the Interstate Highway Act superseded old Highway 66, which was also known because it was so horrible. It had been paved as quickly as it could be paved. And politics entered into a lot of the pavement. There was a place in Illinois that was brick because the lieutenant governor was in the brick business.
Oh yeah.
And there were other places where there were, right-hand turns because of property ownership. And in California, in the Mojave Desert, at a town called Amboy, there was apparently a little bridge outside of town, and the bridges were narrower than the road because it cost more money to build the bridges. And they had railings across the end of the bridges that stuck out. And cars would come along at night and not realize that the bridges were narrower,
Oh.
and there would be horrible accidents. People would get impaled on these railings that came through the windshield. And the guy that we talked to owned a motel, and he had a wrecker. And he told us, he said, there were 9 wreckers in this town, and I never lost when there
Oh,
was an
because he would get there first.
accident, racing to save the people. So the highway was not all, you know, sweetness and light. It was a mess. It was called Bloody 66.
Mm.
And I'm sure a lot of people were thrilled when it was bypassed, except for the people in the small towns, because that was one of their main sources of income. In Seligman, Arizona, I don't know if you want to know all this, but I can go on for days. In,
Yeah.
in Seligman, Arizona, there was a barber who I met named Juan Delgadillo. And he was a barber, but he was also kind of a promoter. And he talked about one day there was traffic, and the next day, after the highway had been bypassed in that area, there wasn't traffic. And he got involved in, I don't know, several months later, and got the powers that be in the area to form a historic Route 66 association. And that was the beginning of Route 66 officially as a tourist attraction. I mean, because that was the first, Arizona had the first club, and then Missouri's had a historic 66 association. All the states have that. And the 1987 in Arizona, that was when the last piece of 66 was bypassed. And it was only a few months later that they organized the Route 66 Association to
I
bring
met
people
him.
back to the
Yeah.
highway. Huh?
Fascinating man. I met him on my travels on 66. Do you think Route 66 would have happened anyway without Cy Avery, or do you think it really needed his driving force to make this happen?
I think it absolutely needed Avery and Woodruff. They were both businessmen. They were both longtime promoters. They were both longtime highway enthusiasts, and they knew how to get people to do what they wanted. I don't know as much about Woodruff, but Avery was a golden tongued orator. He had a twinkle in his eye, and in the course of his life, he also had a farm. He always had a farm, and he raised grasses, and he was, I guess, something of an expert. And he would go out to talk to farm groups, and he always said to them, besides whatever he was supposed to talk about, he would talk about how if the roads were better, they would be able to get their products to town easier.
Mm,
And later, when he was the president of the Chamber of Commerce at one point, but when they opened an airport and began to have airline travel to Tulsa, he called the airways the highways of the skies. I mean, this was a serious road promoter, and I don't know that there were other people that could have matched that. So I think Route 66, as it is today, this worldwide tourist attraction, I don't think that would have happened without Avery.
well, Susan, I appreciate you joining us on the Place for History and giving us insight into one of the fathers, maybe the father of
The
Route
father,
66.
the
Of Route
father. There's a lot
66.
of uncles, but one father.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.